Here we have probably the simplest React application we could end up building. We're bringing in React, getting this from how to start out with React, the CDN for the two React libraries, React and React DOM. And all we're doing here is generating a React element with a horizontal rule. If we go over here, we can end up seeing that. Not the easiest thing to see, but there's our horizontal rule. So that's fine, that works, but obviously the more complex things get, the trickier things get in terms of nesting things. So if we went over here and we said React create element, and we did a div, and underneath the div, we ended up doing a React create element, and we did an H1, and we did our standard hello world. We could go over here and have something a little bit more interesting, maybe. So we could render this on the root, comment this line out. So now we've got something else here, but very early on, we could see that this is going to get really difficult to manage. And that's where something called Babel comes in. And it's important to note that what Babel is. Babel basically will take some code that we write in a different format, which is called JSX, and it will convert it to JavaScript. So how could we end up doing that? Well, there's a two-part process here. Even if you scroll down here on this site, we could actually find that there is a link here to Babel where it says try JSX. And so there's another library we could bring in here called Babel. And if we come up here, put this library in, and we go over here and put in type, what happens is that the browser no longer recognizes this as JavaScript, but this library will look for anything with a type of text Babel, and it will go inside and turn JSX, which we don't have any right here, but it'll turn JSX into regular, plain old JavaScript. So what I'm going to do here, keep this a little bit simple here. I could do the other one in a second. Instead of ever having to do React create element again, when you use Babel, you could put in what looks just like HTML. And excuse me, one thing to note is that this is not JavaScript. If we didn't have this tag here, JavaScript would end up looking at this and throw an exception. This is not a valid character. We're using the less than operator with an HR. That's not valid. But with text Babel, we could go over here and we get our horizontal rule back. If you end up looking at the console, you'll get some information saying, hey, look, you are using this Babel, but be aware that this is not the practice for a production application because it's a bit of a slow process in relation to normal JavaScript because it's transforming this. And if you want to see how it transforms it, and it shouldn't be that big a surprise, if I go over here and I even do this, I'm going over to the Babel site, this is what will end up getting generated. So it makes it a bit easier to do things that are more complex without nesting. So, I mean, one of the things that I could end up doing here is right within this, I could put an H1, close my H1. Again, it's got to be valid code here. And if I go back here, this will also end up running as well. A couple of things that are kind of important here, and you might not realize it when you're writing HTML. You would realize it if you were writing React create element, which this ends up getting transformed to. But you can't do something like this. If I was to go over here, this is valid to put an H1 here. Forget about the div. That's valid. But if I was to go over here and say I want to add a horizontal rule under it, that's not going to end up working. And you get a message that tells you. It says, hey, look, you can't just have two sibling elements here. And the reason for that is that if you thought about how React create element works, it has to start somewhere, right? It's basically building this tree structure. And there's no way for it to build a tree structure if you give it two parents right off the bat. So you could still do stuff like this, but I shouldn't say that. You can't really do stuff like this. But if you wanted to get this same effect, you just have to make sure that you wrap whatever you're putting in here inside of a div. And if you want to, you can make this a lot prettier here. You can indent it so it's a lot more readable. And now this will end up working.